this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. Back in 2019, I think it was, I was covering a trial, both on Law and Crime Network as well as with Court TV, of a pig farmer out of Iowa who took, of all things, a corn rake and impaled his wife on it. He was eventually found guilty. I don't remember a case like that because the level of brutality that's involved in this thing, I'll never forget it, and seeing the crime scene images and that sort of thing. I'm thinking, oh my Lord, and they lived way out, and there's a lot of way out in Iowa. And I've got some dear friends up there. I really do. Beautiful countryside if you like flat and agricultural, which doesn't put me off. Winters are kind of tough, particularly for an old Southern boy, but nice folks. But the brutality of that case, it really made me stop and think for a moment, wow, this could happen out here. He was eventually found guilty. The fellow's name was Todd Mullis. I'm sure that some of you guys remember that case. His wife was Amy. Heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. But today, I've got what I would say is equally a brutal case. Matter of fact, several cases, all stemming from one single individual as the perpetrator, that I would argue is equally as brutal. It's out in an isolated area. It's in farmland. And the tale that I'm about to tell you is going to rock you to your core because there's so much horror associated with this. And to a certain degree, there's so much confusion. But we're going to try to get that straightened out. Coming to you from the beautiful campus of Jacksonville State University, I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Brother Dave, do you have any memory of the Todd Mullis case at all? I do. With the corn rake?
That's what, actually, when you said corn rake, that's when I went, oh, yeah. We do so many stories during the course of any year. But, yeah, I do remember that corn rake story. And the horror that comes from some of these crimes, and I'm glad you mentioned that it's not just one crime, not just one murder. There were four souls here that were ended. And yet in this one, and I'm not trying to be funny, but remember the game Clue?
Yeah.
Colonel Mustard did it in the library with a lead pipe.
Yep. This
is a story that actually kind of is like that because the weapon is a metal pipe.
Yeah, it is a metal pipe. And there were other elements to this that are brought in this case that we could dig forever from a forensic standpoint. And I plan on going kind of deep with this.
Please, because it was in a shed. And when I saw this, it began with a phone call about possible carbon monoxide poisoning. Now,
and I'm going to tell you why I think that came up. I'm glad you mentioned Clue. Here's a bit of trivia that I think that a lot of our friends are not going to be aware of, and they're going to be shocked by. Did you know that, obviously you know that I'm a father, and being a father, there's certain things that you're required to do. One of those things, if you've got kids in the house, is to play board games. And did you know, and I kind of wear it as a badge of honor, maybe it's a badge of shame, I don't know. Did you know that in the entirety of my life, even as a child and into adulthood and parenthood, I've never won a game of Clue. So much for that master's degree in forensic science, huh? We can just set that thing on fire, man.
Wow.
Oh my! I don't know that I have the patience with it, or whatever it is. I get distracted. People go around and they talk about their, low attention span and all that sort of thing. And they start applying all these titles. I got ADHD and all this stuff. I don't know if it's that there are certain games that I loved. I loved playing, the game I really loved? I loved playing Sorry. Maybe it's because I had to say it so much in my life, but I love playing Sorry. I love playing Trouble. You know, the thing where you pump the little bubble and it, you know, it tells you where to move. I love those games. I never was a success at Clue, though. It required too much brain power. So I don't know. If you guys want to go ahead and tune out now, I guess so. I mean, I don't know if that invalidates me as a forensic practitioner or professor. But yeah, you know, you mentioned this, and you show up at a scene, Dave, and I'm glad you mentioned this bit about carbon monoxide.
Right.
You show up at a scene, and particularly where there are multiple deaths, all right? Because one homicide in and of itself can, not always, but can be markedly complex, and you have to take your time working the scene, making sure you're documenting, collecting everything that has to be. But then you add bodies to this, and there are other dynamics that come into play, and they are physical. And I don't mean this like in amongst the living. I mean, there's physical relationships between the decedents, right? And you have to be able to document that. And everything from distance to shared trauma to the degree of clothing. How much are they clothed? You know, do you have somebody that's partially clothed? Is there evidence that somebody was brutalized more than another person that was there? Because, you know, there's how many of these cases have we talked about over the years, Dave, where we've had these events where there will be a multiple death scenario, but there will be that one person that appears to have been singled out.
Right.
You know, where they've been brutalized so much more than anybody else. I think of JJ and Tylee, you know, relative to that, you know, with the Daybell unpleasantness up there. But yeah, in this case, you know, one of the first things that came up was this idea of carbon monoxide asphyxiation.
But carbon monoxide, Joe, would be 4 bodies in sleeping bags, maybe, but you wouldn't see a crime scene. You see people that went to sleep and didn't wake up. That's what carbon monoxide tends to do,
yeah,
right?
You can, but I think that your default position with your brain is you're trying. Most people do not flee to homicide. That's something they don't want to do.
Right.
That, you know, it's like they have to come up, I think, with some other explanation as to why 4 people, of course. Yeah, 4 people.
Yeah.
I will get into the details in a minute, but 4 people are down. So you've got the smell at the scene, which is like inside of a kind of a pole barn kind of thing. It was a tent
inside. They're calling it an outbuilding. And when I looked at that,
I saw pole barn as
the pole barn.
Well,
so I'm thinking, okay, if you think about the big steel beam, you know, that or not beam, but this big steel pole in the middle of the room that acts as a stabilizing unit for the whole metal building around it. I mean, I'm trying to get an idea here, but when I read one article on this, it was talking about the outbuilding / shed, and that Amanda Parker, by the way, the victims here, Romondus Cooper is 44, Amanda Parker is 33, Keonna Ryan is 26, and Brent Brown is 34. And they were killed or died in an outbuilding. And then inside this outbuilding / pole building, there's a tent. And that tent is where the victim, where Amanda at least, was living and had been for some time. Yep. Now, I can add something to this because, as we said, carbon monoxide was the original call. And to me, I'm thinking 4 people asleep and that's it. But I looked at something a little bit further, and the people that Amanda was working with, they're really not, they're beyond upset that their friend was killed, because they were pointing out that she works at a place called the Old Brick House Pub. And they said that from the time that she left and the time the 911 call was made that got 4 dead bodies was less than an hour. Less than an hour, Joseph Scott Morgan, for Amanda Parker. So, again, there are 3 dead bodies and 1 that is really wounded bad and eventually does die.
Right.
But the original call, carbon monoxide. So backing up to that, if you're going on that call, and you and I've talked about the mindset of investigators, police, fire, everybody, first responders, and as you said, last responders, going into a scene with preconceived notions. And that is not a good thing in terms of looking at and investigating a crime. So what are we doing here with carbon monoxide?
It's terrifying. Back years and years ago, almost, myself and two of my colleagues got really ill at a carbon monoxide event or group of deaths. We had an entire family. This was actually in a town called Kenner, Louisiana, where if you've ever flown into New Orleans, you fly into Kenner. That's where Louis Armstrong Airport is, International Airport. And I got called out there. And you roll up on the scene, there's fire trucks. And, when you get out of your vehicle, you're immediately told you got multiple deaths. And in this case, I can't remember the number. It seems like we had 5 dead or maybe even 6 dead in the house. It doesn't get cold in New Orleans very often, or down in South Louisiana during the wintertime. This is like February or something, but we had a cold snap. And in this case, they had talked about how the wall-mounted, those wall-mounted heaters that are kind of built in the wall in the 60s ranch-style houses, it was not functioning. So they had a relative that came over to work on the fan. These things have an exhaust fan. My understanding was he had reversed the flow.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And so when you walk into this thing, all of the people are, like you said, are all in bed, and they're covered, with like blankets. And I don't mean covered like they covered themselves before lying down, is what I'm saying. And they died. We got the all clear to go in. And this is before the days when the fire service had the portable carbon monoxide detectors. They had put huge fans, those fans that you see if you go to a garage, during the summer, where they're, the garage where you take your car, not at your home. I mean, maybe you haven't, but those gigantic fans you see. And they were trying to pull the air out, and they had opened the windows to ventilate it, and they gave us a thumbs up, and we went in. And I'll never forget, man, I looked over I was in with a homicide detective and a crime scene tech and myself. And I looked at my friend who was the crime scene tech, and his eyes were bloodshot.
Oh, wow.
And my head was hurting. And I said, "Is your head hurting?" He said, "Man," he said, "it's just banging, man." And then immediately it hit me. Place was not completely ventilated. We went and grabbed the detective who was busily writing, and you could see the changes in his face as well. And it's like you get caught up in work. You're not really thinking about it. I grabbed him. They had to put us on O2.
Wow.
I had to spend like, I think I spent overnight in the hospital that night.
That's
the interesting thing about carbon monoxide is that once you're exposed to it, they want to keep you on O2 for a protracted period of time, because I have been told at least that there's still a level of lethality 8 hours out from initial exposure. And so when we do autopsies on bodies of individuals that have been exposed to carbon monoxide, even their blood, Dave, even the blood of the dead is like a cherry pink color, and all of the viscera internally, well, you'll see it externally too. The eyes turn pink. The skin, it'll have a pinkish hue to it. And the organs have a pink tint to them as well. It's amazing. And it's the hemoglobin that's reacting to this response. And so, I remember my head hurt so bad, and I hadn't begun to feel drowsy yet. But, in this particular case out in Iowa with these 4 people, the finder knew that one of these subjects inside, and I think it was Cooper, if I'm not mistaken, they were working on a truck inside, and they could smell oil, like heated oil. And I think that they were thinking, well, the vehicle is running inside of there. If you ever wonder why, a garage will leave the bay doors open. These guys are working, in this environment. People don't think that that's dangerous. Well, it's not just a car falling on you or something like that. They have to turn the engines on many times, and so they'll leave the doors open to get ventilation. Well, when they arrived, they're smelling oil in there, and I hold this this thought in my brain about this relative to people. When you walk into a scene, you're not thinking. Your default position is, oh yeah, they've been beaten to death with a metal pipe. And you're thinking, well, they've been exposed to noxious fumes, and either they might still be alive, or maybe they're passed out, deceased. But the one thing that kind of betrayed those thoughts was the fact that upon further examination, each one of these subjects was lying in a pool of their own blood. Recently in the news, there was, I think it was in London, I'm not really sure, and it's happened multiple times, where somebody will, and of course we saw this poor girl up in Charlotte not too long ago, where an individual pulls out a knife and they begin attacking. Of course, she was a single victim, but there was recently, I think we had 8. I think it was in London, that were attacked on a bus. It's not like shooting, is it, Dave? You think, and when you go to a bludgeoning, where we know that a metal pipe is, as a matter of fact, it's a 3-foot long metal pipe. I've envisioned that this thing is probably some kind of galvanized pipe that was used, which is kind of interesting. If any end of one of these pipes is used, I've had this happen before where it's been threaded. You'll actually see a pattern injury that will develop on the surface of the skin, and over the surface of the impact areas. You'll see these threads, and they'll take on the negative image of the threads being impressed into the skin. But back to my where I was going initially, the only way I see this kind of happening, how do you beat 3 people to death or 4 people to death with a metal pipe without this being some type of ambush, Dave? I mean, that you can't, I don't see it. It's not like some, martial arts movie where you got, and, which is always so stupid to me, where you got one guy in the center and he's being attacked by a bunch of people, and you're thinking, why don't you just bum rush him?
Right.
I don't care how high he can kick and all those sorts of things. But you're thinking, how do you attack 4 people? I think, this didn't happen all at one time. This sounds like an ambush, Dave.
It does. And this is something that they're going to have to figure out. Now, what we have here, and whenever I say that, in my head, I'm hearing Cool Hand Luke. What we're dealing with here is failure to communicate.
Communicate, yeah.
Now, Luke Truesdell, 36 years old, he's on the scene when police arrive. And we have the brother of Brent Brown, who actually found the bodies. Now, again, carbon monoxide call comes in to 911. Matt Brown is at the scene and discovers his brother Brent and the others, Keonna Ryan, Amanda Parker, and Romondus Cooper. He discovers them all and the blood, as you mentioned a minute ago. So immediately I went, you got blood everywhere. Who said carbon monoxide poisoning? I mean, I get it that I guess I get that could have been a reason that the people were able to be attacked if they had been overcome with carbon monoxide and then they were beaten to death. But that big question of how does one person use a lead pipe to kill 3, nearly 4 people? that are not handicapped physically.
Right.
They're in good health, apparently. So that's the question that has to be answered. And it's so funny because so many, not funny, strange, not funny, haha.
No. Yeah.
But it's funny that how many times when we look at a story, we want to know, why did this happen? Why did you do this? Like that means anything. And I mean, it doesn't. When you're solving a crime, Joseph Scott Morgan, when you're looking at this, do you ever consider the why? Because does it have bearing on your investigation?
I think, and again, you know how I feel about that word. I hate why. I really do. I guess for some people, it has a bigger impact than it does for me. I'm more about what and how and when and those sorts of things. That there's enough on your plate, particularly at a scene. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's narrow this down to a scene. All right, where you're having to consider all of these other questions that are out there. Why is kind of like way down the list at that point in time? Because first off, you don't have enough data to even formulate something until you've collected all of the scientific data that's out there, and also that's going to be developed at the morgue and in the laboratory. Why is a very leisurely question. All right.
Right.
To me, it is. It's a, that's kind of, why me, that kind of thing. If you take that same idea, that's almost a luxury. Mm-hmm. Now, going down after you have all of the data, you can play around with that all you want. But, famously, as it's been stated over and over again, there's no, particularly in court, you don't have to prove motive. Motive is not on the table. They like to talk about motive, but, there's a lot of other things people like to talk about too, but it's not, it doesn't have as much value in my world. I want to know how this went down relative to first off, the sequencing of it, I think is important because when you've got four people, what could four people have done to either one individual or maybe a group of individuals? Because I got to tell you, Dave, a beating death to me, when I see that and I think about that, that's almost like messaging to me.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what could four people have done, and are they being utilized? Are they being utilized in order to send a message? You're saying that a pipe was utilized to beat somebody to death. Right. The old term is to brain them. I don't know if you
brain them,
that term. Yeah. Brain them.
Okay. We will use that from here on. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Person got brained to death.
Yeah.
Beating over and over again. There's a conclusion that you arrive at, apparently. And I think that in this case they did, because the actual weapon is recovered, and at least there's four victims, right. 4 fatalities eventually, but there's 3 victims, I think, whose DNA is found on the pipe, and then a potential suspect whose DNA is found on the pipe. So you get an idea that, this instrument was used to kill all of them. Well, unless you're passing around to a group of people who are utilizing it individually, here, your turn type of thing, you got one person that's the perpetrator here that's beating somebody to death. And what sequence did this happen in? I think that if you can get to the heart of the sequence, then you can try to understand what the motivation was. Who was the target? And was there a specific target? Or do you just have a madman that is just trying to keep people in a confined space? They have an idea of where a confined space containing or housing 4 people are, if they just want to go randomly victimize a group of people. And they're going to wait. They're going to wait, and they're going to knock hell out of these people until they've beaten them down. And Dave, this is another thing. This really jumped to mind. You kind of opened the door here. You're an old baseball player. Was there ever a time in baseball where you were not as exhausted going in. I mean, like I've always imagined this because I'm not a baseball guy, I'm a football guy, but it seems to me that one of the most exhausting things that you can do, particularly if you got a coach that's right and you're trying to work on your batting stance and your swing, you get in a batting cage and you go in there for a protracted period of time and hit ball after ball after ball. When you get out, I mean, everything's gone, I would think. How much more so, when you're taking a metal pipe and you're beating somebody to death with it. And where do you call no joy at that moment in time? Say, okay, it's over with, it's done. I've sufficiently eradicated this person from the face of the planet. What's the cutoff? What's the cutoff there?
Well, think about it. Anybody who's ever cut wood, if you've ever chopped wood for a fire, same thing. You're swinging something over and over. And at first it's easy. At first it's comfortable. And after a couple of minutes, your arms get tired. Your forearms are the first ones to go. And anyway, when I looked at this, because I'm, again, trying to wrap my head around how did one person, Truesdell, control the situation so that he could beat 4 people at the same time. Now, we're going to assume that he beat 4 people at the same time, because the only thing we really know, Joseph Scott Morgan, is the timetable given to us by Amanda's co-workers, who said the time she left work and the time that 911 was called was an hour. That was it. From the time she left work to the time she's dead, 1 hour. Now, prosecutor, I want to get to this because Trooper Tylor Fairbanks says, when he's asked this question, when did you realize that this was not a carbon monoxide issue? Fairbanks says, once I walked in that overhead door and I saw the first female with blunt force trauma wounds. What made you form that opinion that you were not there for what you were initially called for? Trooper, the carbon monoxide does not create your head to collapse on itself. Wow. And carbon monoxide poisoning also does not leave pools of blood on the ground. Now, Joe, you've got pools of blood on the ground, a head caved in. This is just one victim. Now, you've got blood spatter on the victims, on the walls, on the ceiling, on the floor. Mm-hmm. How do you break this down? Because you've already got investigative people who have come in to determine, checking for vital signs to see who's dead, who's alive. They are able to determine that 3 are already dead. Yep. The 4th is in bad shape and is helicoptered to the hospital, Brent Brown, but he died later. Now, you've got 3 dead on the scene and you've got blood everywhere. How do you, as an investigator, separate this blood spatter over here and this footprint over here and this handprint over here? How do you break all those out to actually try to determine who was killed first?
Okay, let me take this piece by piece because it's very complex when you begin talking about bloodstain patterns. All right. First off, you don't need to move the bodies. This is one of those cases, Dave, where the body, and you're kind of, from an investigative standpoint, you're kind of at an advantage because you're in a closed space, and you're not to say that you're not going to have bloodstain deposition in an outdoor space. However, it's more appreciable in a contained space because you've got everything's happening in this, kind of 3D environment where you've got overhead covering, you've got walls, and you've got floors, right? And then you have the other objects that are contained within that space, and you have other bodies, okay? And then if you're fortunate, you might have a suspect as well. So all of those are going to have potential for deposition of blood patterns on them. You don't want to move the bodies quickly, because one of the things that you're looking for, and people always ask us about they talk about blood spatter velocity, which is a big thing, where you've got this active event. We've got low velocity, medium velocity, and high velocity. High velocity generally exists in the world of firearms because it just makes sense, right? The higher the velocity of the object that's going to slam into a surface and generate blood deposition, it has to be traveling. It doesn't have to be going supersonic, but it has to be traveling at a very high rate of speed. You get into the area of medium velocity. Now you're talking about baseball bats, hammers, pipes. Okay. Those droplets, generally the smaller the droplet, the higher the velocity. And I know that there's people that will disagree with that probably, but that's just kind of a way to think about it. And then when you get to low velocity, that you're talking about using your hands, using your feet, those droplets again are going to be a bit larger. So you're kind of in that medium velocity. You're going to have overlapping patterns too, depending upon the proximity that where these bodies are to one another. So you want to establish what's referred to as a point of origin, the strike point, and there might be multiple strike points. Let me ask you something. Have you ever taken a shot from somebody? You don't have to answer this. Have you ever taken a shot from somebody and then you stand in that same position? Well, that's rare.
No, you move.
Most people are going to move. All right. Now, depending upon now there are events where you will drop a person right where they stand.
Yeah.
You think some big guy, some diminutive person, and you strike them on top of the head, you have enough force, it's going to drop them. But every time, and I'll talk about this with head strikes, if you have an object like a pipe and you're cracking them on the head, well, that first initial strike, particularly if it's a smooth kind of, if it doesn't have like a big textured kind of surface to it, that is the object. Depending upon the angle and how much energy you can generate, most of the time you're not going to completely open up the head. Okay.
Right.
It's going to take another strike, because what you're doing is you're compromising the structural integrity of both the skin and the bone underlying. All right. So I talk to my students about this, and I do not teach at a higher level. I don't teach bloodstain interpretation. One of my colleagues does, but I teach intro, and I've had to do it in the field. I always use the example of a paint can. Okay. Where when you take the paintbrush and you dip it in, okay, that dynamic as you flick it over your shoulder is going to create what's the equivalent of cast off. So if you think about a pipe penetrating a skull, it becomes, the surface of it has blood that's on the surface. As you flick that pipe back in order to, again, facilitate striking down again, well, that blood is literally cast off. It can be cast off in an arcing motion directly above your head. It can go, you can cast it off to the side depending upon what plane you're swinging this thing in. Okay. Wow. The person swinging it can get blood on them. I got a fascinating story. I had one of my colleagues that was actually, he's a forensic scientist, and he was talking, a guy walked up to him at a scene, Dave, where a woman had been, let's see, how did it work? A woman had, in fact, been beaten to death with a hammer, and this guy was wearing a white T-shirt. My colleague that's a forensic scientist, crime scene investigator, along with a detective, were talking to this guy. The guy just walks up and just voluntarily says, "Hey, man, I think I know who might have done this." And as he's talking to them, they say, "Well, go stand over there. We've got your information." The guy turns to walk away, and Dave, he's got a diagonal line of blood deposition running from his right shoulder across to over the top of his left kidney area. They said, whoa, whoa,
wow,
whoa, come here. Like this. And immediately they put the bracelets on this guy and put him in the back of the car. And it turned out he was, in fact, the perpetrator.
Wow.
Okay. So, even the perpetrator, and our friends out there that listen to Body Bags are pretty bright people. All right. So they understand this, that you're not doing this necessarily in a vacuum. So as far as order, you'd ask an excellent question. Can we determine the order? That's difficult to do. I think it is, actually. I think that you're going to have to be more reliant on the status of the bodies. And again, my fallback position is going to be postmortem interval, understanding, had an individual laid in wait and killed that first person early on, and were they cold and stiff? maybe laying there dead before the next victim shows up, and that subject's attacked, and then the next and the next and the next. So that's why not only do you have to leave the bodies in place so you can understand the point of origin for the blood being, coming off the body, you have to leave those bodies in place so that you can thoroughly examine them to try to determine how long they have in fact been dead. Because, Brother Dave, I got to tell you, it's a head scratcher when you think, again, just like I'd earlier stated, that one person is going to take out 4 individuals with a single weapon. It's kind of hard to swallow unless the people would either be inebriated in some way, where, and I've had people that have been beaten to death in their sleep. That does happen, or been beaten to death when they're passed out, or it's an ambush kind of thing. Where you've got somebody that just waits one by one and they begin to hammer on an individual. Dave, every now and then, my wife, Kimmy, and I will say, you know what, we haven't been scared in a while. Let's watch a horror movie. And we don't do it a lot. All right. It's not something that, we engage in with great frequency, but I think the first horror movie we actually watched together, this movie came out in 99. We got married in 99. The first one we ever watched, we picked a doozy, because we didn't know what to expect with this thing. We just heard everybody talking about it, and that's Blair Witch Project. Oh. And I got to tell you, it got my attention because I couldn't, and I hate to sound like, a gullible fool. I'm not saying I'm not a fool. I'm just saying my level of gullibility with this thing, and I don't want to give it away for anybody that hasn't, since 1999.
Yeah, 26 years old. If you hadn't seen it yet.
I think we can safely go down this road. But yeah, I mean, and it scared me. And it scared me in the sense that you got people that are going out looking for something that is infamous, and they're filming the thing the entire time. Dave, there is an element in this case out of Iowa that is fascinating to me, because they have hooked a guy up on charges. And as we are speaking right now, this trial is ongoing. That's one of the reasons I want to talk about it. Am I or am I not correct? And there was an initial conversation that came up in this case where the alleged perpetrator wanted to create a movie. Is that accurate about this case?
Yes, that is accurate. And Luke Truesdell told police a number of things before they gave him the Miranda. You have the right to remain silent. Before they Mirandized him, he made a number of statements. He was at the scene when police arrived. And many of the statements are not going to be heard by the jury. But that was a comment he made, that did he kill 4 people to create the subject matter for a movie? Joe, have you ever heard of such a thing?
No. I assume that somebody else has done this. It sounds rather fantastical, I think, that someone would, and oh my Lord, dark. Yeah. It's the only way I can, that I can really, really describe. You hear about things where people have created fictionalized events, where they're doing it for their entertainment. Right. What was that book that was written all those years ago? The Most Dangerous Game, I think, where, they were hunting people on an island and all those sorts of things.
There was a guy named Mr. Kincaid that was hunting Gilligan on Gilligan's Island. And,
really?
They weren't smart enough to figure out how to grab the bottom of that helicopter to get off the island. But Gilligan survived.
Don't get me started on Gilligan.
At any rate,
I hate that movie. I mean, I hate that TV show for that reason.
Sit right back.
Gilligan. Let me tell you something. Gilligan would have been disposed of early on if I had had anything to do with it.
One day we're going to break down all the times they failed to escape the island. Oh
my God! Oh my Lord! I tell you. But don't get me started. Anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, back to this guy wanting to to do a murder at this level of multiple people for nothing more than to create the subject matter for a movie. I mean, if that is the top of mind, that's why if that is truly the motive, Joe, we have a hollow soul we're dealing with.
I think that we do. But is it? And look, I'm not going to get too deep into social commentary here, but does it really surprise you in the world that we live in nowadays? Because, you can see stuff on social media that is in fact manufactured. Mm-hmm. And I'm not even talking about the AI stuff. I'm just talking about people that go out and, create these various little dramas that are out there. So, in hearing this, I'm not as shocked by this today. And I hate to say that. Oh, my Lord. Mm-hmm. Lord, forgive me. I hate to say that today. I'm not, hang on, let me get this straight. I'm not as shocked by this today as I would have been 10 years ago.
Right.
And just think about it. You say, well, Morgan, God, that's really horrible for you to say. Is it? Because there are people out there that go around and they create these things in order to draw attention to themselves. And is this an indication that this guy has psychopathology going on to the point where he's so debilitated he's got a problem? Well, no, not necessarily. This is something that he desired, according to the authorities. But Dave, they're not allowing this in court, right?
Right. A lot of it. They're allowing parts. Yeah, part of his statement will be allowed, but part of it will not be allowed. And they're going to be arguing more about this during the course of the trial, because it's a big part of why we're here today.
Well, one of the things they teach cops is that if you've got an individual that makes these, what do they call it, spontaneous admissions,
right? You
don't say, hey, it would be in your best interest to shut your mouth at this point in time. We haven't Mirandized you yet. So I'd be very curious about, that status with this trial. Is it, it's not the cop's duty to tell you to shut your mouth. So if this is a spontaneous admission, right, that in most cases, that's valid. Now, if you, other than the way I understand it, other than probative questions like, are you injured? Are you hurt? What's your name? Where are you from? Those sorts of kind of generalized questions that, but as the guy's saying, yeah, my name is Fred Jones. I just cut my wife's head off and put it in a camera bag. That's not, you don't have to Mirandize him, and that can be included.
It really does drive me.
As a matter of fact, they'd gotten to a point where, if I remember correctly, where they were not wanting beat officers to Mirandize people, immediately. You don't ask them questions, probative questions, other than, are you okay?
Yeah.
Because you're just trying to, is there anybody else in the house?
Yeah.
This guy's covered with blood. Is there anybody else in the house that's been injured? Well, you're not asking them to give away anything. You don't want to say, why did you do this?
Right.
Or, what, did you do this, or whatever the case might be.
Obvious that, hey, to look to whoever's standing nearby and say, hey, we were called for carbon monoxide poisoning. What the heck happened?
Yeah.
You can't do that without it getting tossed. I mean, it makes sense to me that would be that's an obvious question, but.
Well, yeah, because, you're being told that it's carbon monoxide, and that humans don't spontaneously, develop holes and defects in their body and blood begins gushing out from them. There has to be an action, that, right. that elicits this physical reaction. And so I find this fascinating that this was kind of the motivating factor behind what the prosecution is saying was driving this individual to beat these people to death, Dave.
I know it. With a lead pipe or with a metal pipe. So if he was truly set up to try to kill people for the sake of creating the log line for a movie, the 4 people he killed, okay, because Brent Brown died because of the beating. But you've got Amanda Parker, 33, involved with Romondus Cooper, 44. He has 2 sons. Keonna Ryan, 26, and Brent Brown, who was 34. Each one was beaten to death. They were found bludgeoned with a metal pipe. And what is trying to come up in court now is what happened and why. Again, why is something we need not necessarily something they need, but why would anybody kill 4 people? And how did he pull it off by himself? The prosecution says it was an ambush, and the defense says it wasn't an ambush. Actually, I don't know what they're saying totally right now because we just hit the prosecution phase. The defense will have their day. But Joseph Scott Morgan, you've got 4 people that were bludgeoned to death with a metal pipe by one person. Only one person is charged in this crime, who claims he was trying to create the plot for a movie. I'm thinking, do human beings not have any value? Do people not have value now that we're seen as nothing more than something that can just be
fodder?
Yeah.
Fodder for entertainment. I don't know. It would seem so, particularly in this case. And I don't know if this is some gigantic social commentary here, but they're going to have to sufficiently explain this. I think one of the first things that we're going to find out is that because, the words carbon monoxide were floated, I'm hoping that the medical examiner, in this case, that they drew blood on each one of these victims, and they will run. I think I've mentioned before, the test is called a carboxyhemoglobin level, and that will give you an indication. We take on in our natural environment, particularly if you live in an urban area, or if you work around vehicles, you're going to take on a certain amount of carbon monoxide. Not all, it's not like you just catch a whiff of it and you die. It's not like that. There's, our body can metabolize it, but when you get an overload of it. And so what you're looking for with that sample, is to see if you're within lethal ranges. And there are lethal ranges that are established, that if you have this percentage on board in your system, that you will not survive. All right. Or you're going to have major problems down the road. So once you get that eliminated scientifically, I think that's pretty important. The other thing that you would be looking for in this case, because they're saying that it is a metal pipe, they've identified that it's a 3-foot metal pipe. When the forensic pathologist testifies to these insults, one of the things they're going to do is both the prosecution and the defense are going to probe this individual and ask them, are all of these injuries, what similarities exist with these injuries and what you're observing at the autopsy doc? If you're looking for certain, the margins of these injuries, I talked about if you've got like a threaded edge on the thing and you're holding it and you're beating someone, are there any similarities between the marks that are found on all 3 of these or all 4 of these victims that you can go back and say, yeah, this appears? Now, you can't say it with absolute, and here's the big difference, absolute scientific certainty. You say it within a reasonable amount of scientific certainty. You can't say there's nothing that's 100%. Even when you talk about DNA, you're talking about, when the person's testifying. But the forensic pathologist will render an opinion that will say, yeah, it appears that a weapon similar to the weapon that we have in question was used in each one of these cases and brought about the death. So that's, again, if you're kind of working your way down the tier regarding, the forensic evidence. And then I think the other big delineation here, Dave, is how many strikes were there?
Oh, wow.
Okay. Now I think that many people can, kind of, and I'm guilty of this, they can opine as to, well, the more strikes you have, the more of a target the individual was. Well, not necessarily. If they were trying to beat the life out of somebody there might be an individual, we've got a lady that has died. I saw her images. She's rather diminutive. She's very tiny. I submit to you that it would not take as much to kill her as it would, say, one of the males. All right. So she might not be beaten to the point where her head is literally pulpified. Remember what the trooper said here.
Yep.
He said one of the reasons he realized that this was not carbon monoxide asphyxiation was because of carbon monoxide. This is a great line. Oh my Lord, talk about a log line for a movie. Carbon monoxide doesn't cause your skull to cave in. All right. So you're going to be looking for the degree of trauma. How many times are they struck over and over and over again? Whereas you might have one or two on one person, you might have multiple on others. And that's kind of hard, man. That's really hard to do an absolute, with beatings in particular. It's very difficult, Dave, to try to say they were struck this many times because you've got all of these overlying injuries. Those injuries that were generated in life, Dave, you're going to have what are referred to as contusion abrasions. And if you've got a person that's being struck in the same spot every single time, those injuries, the contusion abrasions, become, I don't know if the term is, they're overlapping. And the other part to this, too, is that you're going to have commingling of blood at the scene, right. Not just on the scene, but also on the weapon. You can have commingling of blood if he's moving from one body to the next and he spilt blood. Remember, again, what the trooper said about the one victim. There was a pool of blood. We note there are other pools of blood. Well, if you move from one victim, say the initial victim, to the next victim, you're going to have blood deposition in the form of what appear to be footprints that might have originated from another person while, in fact, you're beating the other one to death. A lot of complexity with this case, Dave.
Well, the one thing we do know is that Truesdell and Romondus Cooper were working on a vehicle together. And again, we're getting this information from the suspect in the crime and what he blurted when police arrived and his statements that we don't know what will be in and what will be thrown out. That'll be determined during the course of the trial. But that while they're working on he and Romondus Cooper are working on the vehicle, Cooper handed him the metal pipe. The victim hands it to the suspect because they're working on a vehicle and he needed this pipe for whatever they were doing. And Truesdell says he lost it. Now, he does claim that he hit Cooper first. He took him out first because he was the biggest. And that Brown might have tried to defend himself and that, he did survive long enough to be airlifted to the hospital. And the two women were both destroyed right there. That's pretty much what we know, that there were things said by Truesdell to police and beyond that the noises in his head that were affecting him before the murders no longer existed after. So we're going with the voices in the head scenario. So they had him psychologically looked at before moving forward with the trial. So just letting you know, that's the standard that we're dealing with here in terms of Truesdell and his admission of guilt and then pleading not guilty and the case being at trial. Now, we'll have to keep you updated on what happens once the defense has their day. So as you're listening to this now, there will be an update, and Joe and I will get back together and make sure we provide that once the jury returns with their verdict.
I think that probably this is another, again, example of you don't have to live in some huge metropolis for evil to visit you. It can present itself just like it did in the Todd Mullis case, in a barn with a corn rake. And evil can also visit in an outbuilding being used as a garage to try to work on an old car. You never know where it's coming from. But I do know this. I do know that we are not cannon fodder, that each one of us has value. And as long as I'm doing this show, that every single victim will have value. None of us are merely props in a movie. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.